You're an adult now. Bills paid. Job secured. Life figured out. So why do you still feel like something's missing? Like there's a hollow space inside you that no achievement, relationship, or distraction can fill? What if I told you that the emptiness you feel isn't a flaw in who you are now? It's an echo of who you never got to be. Meet Christina. 35 years old. Successful marketing director. Married. 2 kids. Instagram perfect life. But every night after her family goes to sleep, she sits in her car in the driveway and cries. She doesn't know why. She just knows that somewhere along the way she lost herself, and she has no idea how to find her way back. Her therapist asked her one question that shattered everything. When was the last time you felt like a child? Christina couldn't remember, because she never really was one. And that absence, that stolen childhood, is the wound that's been bleeding into every corner of her adult life. Because what nobody tells you about lost childhoods is this: when you're forced to grow up too fast, you don't just skip a phase. You abandon a part of yourself that never stops waiting to be rescued. Before we reveal what happened to Christina, you need to understand what happens in the brain when childhood ends before it's supposed to. In 2020, researchers at Harvard Medical School studied adults who experienced parentification, children forced into adult roles prematurely. Brain scans revealed something devastating. These individuals showed underdevelopment in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for self-identity and emotional regulation, while showing overdevelopment in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the area associated with planning, responsibility, and executive function. Their brains had been rewired for survival, not for being. They became hyper-competent adults with a child inside who never learned how to play, rest, or simply exist without purpose. But this rewiring doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in moments when a child is told, through words or silence, that their childhood is a luxury the family can't afford. Picture this: 9-year-old Isaiah comes home from school to find his mother crying on the couch. His father left last week. Bills are piling up. Isaiah doesn't ask to play outside. He doesn't mention he's hungry. Instead, he goes to his room, does his homework in silence, then comes downstairs and asks, "Mom, what can I do to help?" At 9 years old, he became the parent. In that moment, that heartbreaking, impossible moment, Isaiah's brain learned the most damaging lesson of his life. My needs are a burden. My childhood is selfish. I am only valuable when I'm useful. This is how lost childhoods begin. Not with dramatic abuse but with quiet theft. The theft of innocence, of playfulness, of the fundamental right to be cared for instead of being the caretaker. The brain is supposed to develop in stages. Childhood is when you learn safety, trust, play, imagination, the foundation for healthy adult functioning. But when a child has to become an adult too soon, those stages get skipped. The brain says, "We don't have time for play. We don't have time for emotions. We need to survive." And the child learns to perform adulthood while their inner world stays frozen in time, waiting for someone to tell them it's finally safe to be young. And here's where it gets devastating. Because that 9-year-old doesn't just grow up responsible. They grow up disconnected from joy, spontaneity, and the ability to receive care. And it looks like this. Number 5, you're terrified of being irresponsible. The thought of doing something just for fun feels wrong. Wasteful. Like you're failing at life if you're not being productive every single moment. Number 4, you can't ask for help without drowning in shame. You're the helper. The strong one. The person everyone depends on. Needing support feels like weakness, like you're breaking a role you were cast in before you could speak. Number 3, you parent everyone around you. Your friends, your partner, your actual parents. You're always the one solving problems, giving advice, holding space, while no one holds space for you. Number 2, rest feels like punishment. You can't relax without anxiety creeping in. A day off feels like wasted time. Your brain can't distinguish between resting and being lazy, between self-care and selfishness. Number 1, you feel empty even when your life looks full. You check all the boxes, career, relationships, accomplishments, but none of it touches the hollowness inside. Because you're living someone else's idea of adulthood while your authentic self is still waiting to be born. Let me take you back to Christina. When she was 7, her mother got sick. Really sick. Cancer. Her father worked 2 jobs to pay for treatment. Her older brother escaped into drugs. So Christina became the good daughter. She made dinner. She helped her mother to the bathroom. She did the laundry, cleaned the house, forged her mother's signature on permission slips. At 7 years old, she became the mother. Her actual mother survived. But Christina's childhood didn't. And nobody noticed. Because she was so good at it. So responsible. So mature for her age. Everyone praised her. What a good girl. So helpful. So strong. But what Christina's brain heard was, your value is in your service. Your worth is in your sacrifice. Keep performing or you'll lose the only love you have. 28 years later, she has her own family. And she's still performing. Still overfunctioning. Still convinced that if she stops taking care of everyone else, she'll stop mattering. Because a 2019 University of Michigan study on childhood parentification found that 71% of adults who were forced into caretaker roles as children reported chronic feelings of emptiness, difficulty with identity formation, and what researchers called compulsive competence. The inability to stop functioning even when it's destroying them. Christina didn't lose touch with her inner child. She never got to meet her in the first place. But the cruelest part isn't the lost childhood itself. It's that the world rewards you for it. Meet James. 32, Christina's husband. He loves her. He appreciates everything she does. But he's also confused. Because every time he tries to plan something fun, she's anxious. Every time he suggests she take a break, she finds another task. Every time he asks what she needs, she says nothing while clearly falling apart. In therapy, he finally said, I feel like I married someone who's afraid to be happy. Like she thinks she doesn't deserve to enjoy life. Christina broke down. Because he was right. She'd spent so long being the responsible one, the caretaker, the adult in the room, that she'd forgotten how to be anything else. A 2021 study on relational patterns in parentified adults found that they often struggle with intimacy because they can only relate through service. They don't know how to be loved, only how to earn love through usefulness. When someone tries to care for them, their nervous system panics. Because care wasn't part of the childhood script. The equation was simple, I give, therefore I am. But real relationships require receiving, vulnerability, the courage to be cared for. And when you never learn that it's safe to be taken care of, adult relationships feel like constant performance. Until you collapse from exhaustion, wondering why connection feels so lonely. This is the hidden cost of a lost childhood. It doesn't just steal your past. It hijacks your present and your future. So if this wound runs this deep, can it ever heal? Here's what changes everything. Understanding that it's never too late to give yourself the childhood you deserved. A 2022 study from the University of California followed adults in reparenting therapy, the practice of consciously meeting the needs their younger selves never had met. After 1 year, participants showed significant decreases in anxiety and depression, and reported feeling more whole and more themselves than they ever had. Because the child inside you isn't gone. They're just waiting. Let me tell you what happened to Christina. 6 months into therapy, her therapist gave her an assignment that felt absurd. Spend 1 hour this week doing something purely for fun. No productivity. No purpose. Just play. Christina's first response, I don't know how to play. Her therapist, I know. That's why we're starting now. So Christina went to an art store. She bought finger paints, something she'd never been allowed to use as a child because they were too messy. She sat on her kitchen floor alone and painted. No goal. No product. Just color and movement and mess. And she cried. Deep, body-shaking sobs. Because for the first time in 28 years, she was letting herself be the child she never got to be. The second practice, the permission list. Christina had to write down everything she wasn't allowed to do or feel as a child, then give herself explicit permission to do or feel those things now. I wasn't allowed to be scared. I give myself permission to be scared. I wasn't allowed to need help. I give myself permission to need help. I wasn't allowed to play. I give myself permission to play. Reading this list out loud felt like rebellion. Like breaking a sacred rule. But here's the neuroscience. When you consciously give yourself permission to have needs, you're activating the prefrontal cortex to override the old survival programming. You're teaching your nervous system that childhood wasn't a weakness. It was a right you deserved. The third technique, the inner child dialogue. Every week, Christina wrote a letter to her 7-year-old self. Not about what that child did wrong. About what she needed to hear. You shouldn't have had to be that strong. It wasn't your job to hold everyone together. I'm so sorry no one protected your right to be young. The first few letters she could barely write through the tears. But slowly something shifted. She wasn't just grieving the childhood she lost. She was reclaiming the right to experience joy, spontaneity, and care now. And it worked. 9 months later, her daughter asked her to play dress-up. Usually, Christina would say, maybe later, and go do laundry. This time, she took a breath and said yes. She put on a princess costume. She danced around the living room. She laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. Her daughter said, "Mommy, you're fun." And Christina realized she'd spent 35 years believing that being fun, playful, or carefree was irresponsible, when really, it was the most responsible thing she could do, for herself and for her family. So here's how to know if your lost childhood is still haunting you. Ask yourself, do you feel guilty when you're not being productive? Do you struggle to enjoy things without a purpose? Do you feel more comfortable giving care than receiving it? Do you look at carefree people and feel resentment or confusion? Can you remember the last time you did something purely because it made you happy? If you said yes to any of these, listen carefully. Your childhood isn't gone. It's just waiting. Waiting for you to finally say, "It's safe now. You can come out." You don't have to be useful to deserve care. Because here's what they don't tell you about lost childhoods. You don't lose them once. You lose them every day you refuse to reclaim them. Every time you prioritize productivity over play. Every time you say, "I'm fine," when you're not. Every time you give to others while starving yourself. You're re-abandoning that child over and over. But here's the truth that will set you free. You can't change what was taken from you. But you can give yourself what you needed then, right now. A 2023 study on post-traumatic growth found that adults who actively reparent themselves don't just heal from their childhood wounds. They often report experiencing joy and aliveness they never knew were possible. Because they're not just recovering who they were. They're discovering who they could have been all along. The person with the lost childhood doesn't need to stay lost. They need permission to finally be found. And it starts with one small act of rebellion, choosing play over productivity, joy over usefulness, being overdoing. Tonight, I want you to try something. Think of one thing you loved as a child but stopped doing because you grew up. Dancing, drawing, building with blocks, reading fairy tales, running through sprinklers. Now do it, even for 5 minutes, especially if it feels silly. That's not nostalgia. That's reclamation. You're telling the child inside you, "I see you. You matter." And it's finally safe to play. One small moment of joy. One act of choosing yourself. That's how healing begins, not by fixing what's broken but by finally feeding what was starved. And here's my question for you. If you could go back and tell your younger self one thing, what would it be? And why are you still waiting for permission to give yourself what that child needed? Comment below. Because your childhood may be lost. But the child inside you isn't gone. They're just waiting for you to finally come home.